Today, we do an analysis of an interview with a professional sovereign citizen. Hello, everyone. I'm attorney Joe Pometto, and this is the Joe Pometto Law Show, where we break down police incidents, talk about sovereign citizens, auditors, and criminal defense in general. Today, I want to do an analysis of an interview on RT, the Russian news network, with an American sovereign citizen. I call this individual a professional sovereign citizen. He's very well spoken. He has very well formed ideas, but unfortunately, I'm here to tell you that I can take down every single one of them, and I am going to do so today. So before we get started, take a sip with me. I have a half-finished Coke. It was cool, but now it's not. If you like my content, in the description below, I've set up a Patreon and a PayPal. You can donate directly to me. All of that money will go towards supporting me so that I can free up more time to make more and better videos. I want to do a whole series on the Constitution. Without direct donations, I'm not going to be able to dedicate the time to do that. We'll go through the history, the philosophy before the Constitution, the history leading right up to the Constitution, the drafting of the Constitution itself, and interpretation of constitutional law up until the present day. I want to go through all the amendments. It'll be a lot of fun. We will all learn something at the same time. So if you're interested in me doing that, become a patron. You also on Patreon. You also get exclusive content. Send me a direct donation, and this show will always remain free. So you can support it in free ways as well. Subscribe, like, and share. Now let's watch that Russian interview with my professional sovereign citizen.
Best of the rest of the news, there are between 100,000 and 500,000 Americans who believe the United States government and its court system are completely illegitimate. As a result, these Americans typically don't obey many laws, sometimes drive without driver's licenses, and don't pay taxes. And no, I'm not talking about General Electric. Instead, I'm talking about the sovereign citizen movement. It's a loosely organized group of Americans from around the nation who, for the most part, operate under the radar. And with numerous lawsuits against police and public officials, and behavior sometimes outside our legal system, sovereign citizens are becoming a real thorn in the side of local, state, and federal governments. But now the state of Georgia wants to fight back. Republican State Representative B.J. Pack introduced legislation to disarm sovereign citizens, one of their most frequently used tactics, the filing of lawsuits and liens to tie up public officials in costly legal battles. The legislation would criminalize filing false liens with a fine of up to $10,000 and jail terms of up from 1 to 10 years. So how will this bill affect the sovereign citizen movement? And what exactly are they after? Joining me now is Alfred Adask, sovereign citizen and constitutionalist, as well as a talk radio host and the author of several books, including The Nature of Money. Alfred, welcome.
Hi, how you doing, Tom?
Great to have you with us. Now, if I understand this right, what you call American common law has been hijacked by admiralty law, which is why our birth certificates and driver's licenses are printed in all capital letters. And when we're born, our government creates a secret shell corporation using our name in all caps and keeps hundreds of thousands of dollars in that account. Is that a reasonable description of your position?
It's not a reasonable description of my position, but it's a reasonable description of a number of people's position. I'm aware of a bunch of different theories, and when you people talk about a sovereignty movement as if it was monolithic, and it's not. There's a large variety of people who have different slants on the sovereignty concept. And the one you're describing is embraced by some people, but it's not embraced by all.
Okay, so you said this isn't one that you particularly embrace. What then for you makes you a sovereign citizen as opposed to the persons that I just described?
Declaration of Independence. If you understand sovereignty, you're going to go back in history to begin to grasp the concept. When you had a king in England or a king in France or a king in Spain, they were sovereign. The reason they were sovereign is because they went through a coronation ceremony in a church. The church declared them to be king, and they gave them a crown to wear on their head, and that crown was intended to emulate the corona you see around the heads of the Christ and the saints in medieval paintings. The idea was that the kings, the sovereigns, received their rights directly from God. They had the divine right of kings.
And Jefferson flipped that upside down.
He didn't just flip it upside down, he destroyed it. Everyone in England, the only person in England who was a sovereign was the king. He got his rights directly from God. All else were subjects because they did not get their rights from God.
No, I get that, and I totally get it. That, you know, what Jefferson was saying is that we, the people, are the sovereigns in this nation. But the Declaration of Independence was written by a group of people who were occupied by a foreign nation, and they threw off those occupiers. They threw, you know, much like, you know, the people in Iraq or Afghanistan are trying to get rid of us, I think. We are not, to the best of my knowledge, right now, occupied by a foreign nation. We are occupied by us. Our government is us.
Sovereignty has nothing to do with whether you're occupied or not. Sovereignty flows from God. What most people don't understand, including people in the alleged sovereignty movement, they don't understand that this is a spiritual concept. This is not simply politics. This is spiritual. It's based on the idea.
But what would you make different, Alfred? What would you make different than from today's, you know, today's government? If right now, you know, the U.S. government
says, it's just a matter of recognition. There's a case called Chisholm versus Georgia, 1793. The Supreme Court. This is 4 years after the Constitution was adopted, 17 years after the Declaration of Independence. And I'm looking at it and I'm reading from it right now, and it says in part, they're talking about the situation in England and Europe, how it compared to a particular case. And the court says the same feudal ideas run through all their jurisprudence, meaning the English jurisprudence, and constantly remind us of the distinction.
So you think America is becoming feudalistic?
And the subject, oh, it's becoming fascist.
Okay, is it a problem for you that you know? Okay,
let me finish.
Go ahead.
Let me finish. This is important. You can find this for yourself. You look up the case Chisholm versus Georgia, 1793. It continues. First, they talk about feudalism, where the prince is different from the subject, the prince being the sovereign. It says, no such ideas obtain here. At the Revolution, the sovereignty devolved on the people, and they are truly the sovereigns.
How is that different from today?
It's absolute. Here's the difference.
Give me an example.
If I'm a sovereign, the government is my public servant.
Right.
If I'm not a sovereign, I'm a subject, and the government is my master. And that is the fundamental conflict that's going on right now.
So you think that you shouldn't have to answer to a police officer who says you're speeding?
Not saying that at all. There's some people that they take that idea and they run with it. There's some people who claim that they are sovereigns and they don't have to obey any laws.
Right.
Those people aren't sovereigns, they are anarchists. There's a completely different situation.
What about the sovereign citizens who complain that America is getting less white and more brown, less Christian and more Muslim and atheist, and therefore it's not consistent with the founding? Your thoughts on that?
I don't think that it's relevant to sovereignty. Declaration says all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That establishes we are all getting our rights from God. It establishes that we are all sovereigns in the same sense that the King of England was a sovereign because he had the divine right of kings.
Is our sovereignty infringed upon by having to pay taxes?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily.
So what is infringing on our sovereignty, on our individual sovereignty?
Well, what is infringing on our individual sovereignty?
Yeah.
Whenever the government violates the terms of the Constitution. For example, there's reason to believe that the income tax was designed to apply only within the territories of the United States, not within the
So the income tax then is a violation of our sovereignty?
No, the income tax is legal within the territories, but it may not be legal within the states of the Union.
So it's legal in Puerto Rico, but not here?
It's possible that it appears there's reason to believe that might be true. All right, and it's part of the reason why when people go to court and they complain about the constitutionality of a law, the court will routinely decide in favor of the law's constitutionality. They say if it could be constitutional anywhere, it's okay. It's not unconstitutional.
Alfred, thanks so much for being with us. I'm sorry, we're flat out of time, but you did, I think, a brilliant job of presenting your perspective. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now to hear from the
Well, I hope you enjoyed the Russian interview with the professional sovereign citizen, Mr. Adask. There is a lot to unpack there, and I'm going to do my best to take it apart in a logical and coherent way. First, I will have to say, Mr. Adask presents his arguments. In a very well spoken manner. He's a very articulate gentleman, and I thought the interview was went well. It was well received by both the interviewer and the interviewee, and I wish there was more discourse in our country that was like this. But the interviewer did interrupt this guy a bunch of times. It seems to me one of the tactics of sovereign citizens is just pulling pieces of arguments and law from here and from there and under here, okay, and putting it all together into like a big sort of mumbo jumbo. And that's not a good way. I mean, it sounds good. It sounds good. And I believe that that is the reason why the sovereign citizen movement has as much well, there's a lot of reasons, but it sounds good to the uneducated or the untrained mind. You're like, wow, this makes sense or that makes sense. And especially when you have someone who's articulate and well spoken, communicating that message, it becomes more persuasive. But when you start to break it down systematically, you can see how incorrect it is. It's funny he brings up, so he talks about the issue, the general concept of sovereignty and how in medieval times the king was crowned with a crown that simulated the halo of Jesus or the angels, and in that sense it was God crowning the king who was the sovereign, who was the absolute dictator and or monarch. Now, let's think about this realistically. I mean, what really gave kings their power? Kings actually got their power from their armies and from the military. Now, having the idea that they were chosen by God gave them legitimacy. But kings and queens and emperors and rulers from every walk of life outside of Europe, because this is a European focused idea, but it's actually not, because through the centuries, rulers claimed that they were given their power from God or from the supernatural, and that gave them legitimacy to reign. But in reality, the Roman Empire ruled because the Romans had the best military in the world. The kings and queens of France and England and Spain, they ruled because they had the power to rule, meaning they had the armies, they had the muscle, they had the money, and that's how they got in power. And when someone came along with more muscle and more money and more power and bigger armies, that person would no longer be in charge. Kings throughout England and France in medieval times and all over the world have been dethroned over and over and over again. So that concept of sovereignty granted by God is nice, and it adds a little extra oomph or legitimacy to their rule. But this is by no means that's an illusion to a certain degree. Okay, so he talks about how the founding fathers of the United States threw off the chains of Great Britain. I love the founders and I love my country. And they made the people the sovereigns over the king himself. And there is some truth to that, but not in the way that this gentleman may believe it. This gentleman may believe that if every individual in a country is a ruler, okay, then you don't have a country. okay, you have chaos, or you have tribes, or you have a state of nature in which people fight and kill each other in small groups, and it's a constant chaotic and anarchic struggle. You need a ruler. Now, what we have done in the United States with the Constitution and free and fair elections is created a social contract between the government and between the people, where the government rules by the consent of the governed. So, we have a Republican system. The people get to vote and they get to put into office their elected representatives for certain periods of time. And those representatives have a tremendous amount of power, but that power can be taken away from them at the end of their election, or when they become extremely unpopular, they can also be weakened by public opinion. It's a social contract theory. It is not this concept of every man, every woman a sovereign. Every man or every woman a king means you don't have a country, okay? You have a bunch of people with no laws and no rules. So I don't accept his argument that the people are and I agree that a lot of these ideas come from the Bible and the Judeo-Christian Greco-Roman background that this country is built on, and I'm extremely thankful and respectful of that. Okay, but you are not, every person is not a king in this country. No, the laws apply to you. The government has a degree of force over you, okay, while you are within the realm of the country, in line with the laws. We are a country of laws, and laws rule. Now, he brings up this Chisholm versus Georgia case. And the interesting thing about this case is, well, it's not that interesting. It's just extremely old. We're talking about a Supreme Court case from 1793. It's considered the first Supreme Court case of significance and impact because it was so early. Now, what happened here, I believe, was that let's see here. The executor of an estate attempted to sue the state of Georgia over payments due to him for goods that he had supplied Georgia during the American Revolutionary War. The defendant, the state, refused to appear, argued it could not be sued without granting its consent to the suit. Ultimately, the the United States Supreme Court sided with the plaintiff, with the individual. However, in 1795, the 11th Amendment was ratified to negate the holding in Chisholm. Under the 11th Amendment, citizens of one state or foreign countries can only sue a state with the state's consent. Now, this is a concept that consists in the law, and it is called sovereign immunity. Now, that idea that you can't sue the government used to be very steel-proof. Over the centuries and recent decades, the government has in fact given its consent to be sued in a whole number of manners. So, you know, this guy who was owed money from the Revolutionary War sues the state of Georgia. Georgia doesn't show up. The Supreme Court says you win, and we agree with your argument. You can sue the state. Then the Congress actually changed the law in the Constitution, passed an amendment granting sovereign immunity to the states and likely the federal government. But over time, that has been eroded. It is still true today that you can't sue the government for certain types of things. So those laws that allow the government to be sued are limited, but in my opinion, they are very fair, and they're usually the instances where you would want to sue the government. So what this guy did in this video talking about Chisholm v. Georgia is he pulled dicta. Dicta are just words in a court case that don't actually have the effect of law. So when the Supreme Court, this is a common law principle, when the Supreme Court makes a decision, the holding is the actual law. So if let's say the Supreme Court casts down a law for being unconstitutional. They say, oh, this law requiring people to be executed for speeding tickets is in violation of the Constitution, which forbids cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, boom. It's going to apply, depending on how they word it, it's only going to apply to speeding tickets. Okay, so you may still be able to execute people for other law. Now, before they got to that conclusion, the court probably wrote all these paragraphs of supporting reasoning, precedent, and history. That language itself is not the law. So this gentleman, yeah, they might have talked about the concept of sovereignty in that opinion, but that doesn't make it the law. So, he's using it as a bit of persuasive argument. However, that is not for a fact. That is not the law just because the Supreme Court stated it. So, let's see. Another thing that he says is oh, the Supreme Court, they always find a law constitutional. They always find a law constitutional. It's true that the courts generally defer to the constitutionality of a statute. But that's because when they write the laws, 90 to 95% of the time, they do everything, the legislators do everything they can to write laws that are constitutional. So you can think of the role of the Supreme Court as this body that looks at laws written by the state and the federal government, all 50 states and the federal government. They write these laws, right? You got all these legislatures always writing laws and coming up and drafting them acts for their state. And the Supreme Court, if there's a challenge, they look at it and they say, well, is this law good within the Constitution? Most of them are going to be constitutional because the people writing them are not just pulling them out of thin air. Okay? No, they're writing laws in line with the Constitution. And occasionally, a law is struck down for unconstitutionality. Obergefell was a recent decision in which the United States Supreme Court struck down any law that banned gay marriage as being unconstitutional. It's an example right there of them finding a law to be unconstitutional. There's likely tens of thousands of examples of the Supreme Court finding laws unconstitutional. So again, he's picking these little pieces of argument and trying to create this tapestry that is more like throwing paint on the wall, if you ask me. So a couple other things that he talks about, and I addressed this in my prior videos. Okay, God-given rights. Like I said, our ideas in this country do come from a Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman background, and we recognize basic human rights. Those rights are only protected when those laws and rules are put into a constitution and or a document. Now, if he believes that there is a certain human right that's not being respected, he should advocate for it to be put into law, because the only way our God-given rights are protected is when we draft laws that ensure that they are protected. Listen, we all have a God-given right to life. It doesn't mean that someone can't come along and kill you and take that away. The reason murder is outlawed is because we understand the precious, that we have an understanding that every life is a precious gift from God and should be protected. So that's why it is in the law. Just like the Bill of Rights and what I just spoke about, cruel and unusual punishment, the articulation of these concepts into law is what gives them their strength and protects your humanity. So if he has an argument that there is something that's not actually, you can't just say use God-given right to protect everything that you want. You can't just say, oh, well, God created every individual as a sovereign, therefore nothing you do to me is legitimate, etc., etc. Okay, that's ridiculous. Immanuel Kant, I don't know if he made this argument. I know there's philosophers, that God is based on reason. He imbues his ideas with reason. And so your ideas of human rights must be based on reason, rationality, and logic. And through that structure, God expresses himself. Okay. It doesn't make sense for every individual to be a sovereign, and for every individual to be a sovereign I'm sorry, is not a God-given right. So I can't accept that argument. The final interesting argument that he made talked about the right to tax. I kind of knew this, but I wasn't fully aware of this prior to the second decade, it'd be the 1910s. The United States federal government primarily derived its income through tariffs and small taxes here and there. It wasn't until 1916 that a progressive income-based tax was imposed. Prior to 1916, the Congress, and this goes against what our professional sovereign said again, Congress passed a general income tax, a federal general income tax, and the courts struck it down. The Supreme Court struck it down as unconstitutional. And I found this very interesting because Section 1 of the Constitution provides that direct taxes must be apportioned amongst the states. And the income tax law that the federal government had passed did not provide for apportionment amongst the states. In order for them to fix this problem and create a legislative scheme under which the federal government could tax individuals' income, they had to pass the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment allows the government to to take direct taxes, okay, without apportioning them amongst the states. So I found that to be very fascinating. Prior to 1916 and the 16th Amendment, the United States government was not able to take an income tax from individuals. Now, there's this argument that the tax code only applies to the United States territories, which District of Columbia, Guam, Puerto Rico, Northern Mariana Islands, etc. I don't know exactly where that comes from. I think they pull some language out of the Internal Revenue Code and other laws and portions of the Constitution. Again, they're playing a word game. A lot of what sovereign citizens do is play a language game. Here's the thing is certain words can be interpreted in certain ways. I could say something, I'm trying to think of a good example. Even the word truth, people have different concepts of what the word truth is. Or you may, words can be spun. We all know that. It's common knowledge. And what they do is the sovereigns argue for different interpretations. They put different spins on different words, and it's disingenuous and it is dishonest because when read in context, the meaning is generally very easily understood. Also, within the law itself, there's a plain meaning rule where words are meant to be read as the plain meaning or the actual legal meaning that they have. And for you to read a word read a word into something that doesn't actually is really a stretch, okay, is very disingenuous. Frankly, it's dishonest. And that's a lot of what these sovereign citizens do. It's ridiculous to argue, frankly, that the laws of the federal government only apply to the territories. 13 states ratified the United States Constitution, and every state since has been accepted under the rules of the Constitution. In the United States, it's stated specifically in the preamble of the Constitution that the United States is what they are signing up for, and every state that did it signed up for it. There's also a clause in the Constitution, the Supremacy Clause, which is 200 years of jurisprudence where federal law overrides any state law. So the Supremacy Clause and and there's also the judicial review. The concept of judicial review allows the Supreme Court to strike down the laws of the states. That was very disputed early on in this country, but it's now widely accepted. All the case law out there supports it, and if you apply the plain meaning rule, there's no way that you won't come to that conclusion. So this gentleman had an interesting little argument. He didn't get to he needed a lot more time, and again, that's always true with sovereign citizens because they're pulling so many concepts together. Listen, if a concept generally can't be summarized in a sentence or two, and this isn't always, but if you can't summarize your concept into a couple of sentences, there's a high likelihood that your concept is a bunch of malarkey, BS, nonsense. So thank you for tuning in to the Joe Pometto Law Show. I hope you enjoyed my analysis of this professional sovereign citizen interviewed by the Russians. Just, a quick summary. Federal laws overrule state laws. The Supreme Court has the power to strike down state laws and federal laws. That's called judicial review. And the Supremacy Clause. The progressive income tax wasn't passed in the United States until, I believe, around 1916, and human God-given rights are only protected when they are put into law, and you have a government to enforce those laws. And I'm for small government. So if you enjoyed this show, please subscribe, like, and share. If you want to see more videos like this, want me to dedicate more time to creating this content, please become a patron on Patreon or make a direct donation. Thank you very much. Bye.